Not every robot vacuum holds just dust and dirt. In my case, it held my husband's affair. Diana Harmon was 43 years old, with dark brown hair streaked with golden highlights that fell in soft waves past her shoulders, blue-gray eyes that could find beauty in the most barren patch of soil, and a quiet kind of steadiness that people often mistook for contentment. She had spent 20 years inside the same marriage, inside the same house, inside a routine she called stability, because she had never once stopped to ask herself whether stability and happiness were actually the same thing. And it was on an ordinary Tuesday morning in October, with her coffee going cold on the kitchen counter and the pale autumn light pressing through the blinds in thin, tired stripes, that the ground disappeared beneath her feet. Quietly, without warning, in the most mundane and devastating way imaginable. But to understand how that morning changed everything, it helped to go back a little. Not far, just far enough to see what Diana, for years, had chosen not to see. Diana grew up with her hands in the dirt, literally. She was the daughter of a man who spent his entire life tending to other people's gardens, and she had inherited from him not just the trade, but the genuine love of watching things grow. As a child, she would kneel beside him in the flower beds, watching his hands work with a patience that seemed almost impossible, adjusting roots and loosening soil with the care of someone who understood that certain things simply could not be rushed. She learned early that a plant placed in the wrong spot wilts slowly, without drama, without announcement, and that most of the time you only notice when it is already too late to save it. It was a lesson she memorized for the garden and forgot to apply to her own home. By 22, Diana was interning at a local landscape design firm. By 28, she had her own clients. By 43, she was known throughout the region as one of the most creative landscape designers in the area, the one who transformed backyards into places where people actually wanted to spend time, who thought about the light of each season before choosing a single flower, who understood that a well-designed garden tells a story without needing a single word. At work, she was precise, confident, and completely in control. She knew exactly what each space needed, which plants would thrive together, which layout would serve a client's life best. She was a woman who understood patience and care better than almost anything else. At home, it was a different story. Not that Diana was weak or without a voice. She had simply accepted, over the years, a division of responsibilities that seemed reasonable at the beginning and quietly became habit before she noticed how far it had taken her from her own decisions. Trevor handled what he called the technical side of the house: the wireless router, the streaming subscriptions, the smart doorbell he installed one September weekend with the focused seriousness of a man performing surgery, the programmable thermostat that nobody else knew how to adjust, and, for the past 2 years, the robot vacuum that had arrived in a large glossy box presented almost like a gift for both of them, but which he had set up alone, registered alone, password-protected alone, and programmed to run on the days he decided alone. Whenever Diana tried to touch any of these devices, Trevor would appear with that expression of his, not aggressive, just slightly impatient, just enough to make her step back, and say, with the tone of someone doing her a favor, "Leave it. I'll handle it. You don't have the patience for this kind of thing." And she would leave it. In the beginning, she found it almost endearing. It was just his way, that need to be useful on his own terms. Then it became convenient. Eventually, she simply stopped trying. Trevor handled the technology. Diana handled other people's gardens. The arrangement seemed balanced. The marriage seemed to work. And for years, that appearance of balance was enough to keep either of them from asking questions neither wanted to answer. They had 2 teenage children. Ryan, 16, tall and quiet like his father, devoted to soccer and to short answers, and Lily, 14, who had her mother's blue-gray eyes and a personality that already felt too large for the house they all shared. The four of them moved through a rhythm of school schedules, practice runs, rushed dinners, and weekends that passed faster than they should have. They took one vacation a year, went out for dinner on Friday nights when everyone's schedule allowed, and could still manage conversations about something other than household logistics. From the outside, the Harmons were a stable couple, the kind other people pointed to as an example without knowing anything about what existed behind their front door. Trevor was 46 and a minority partner in a local gym network, 3 locations spread across the city, with a 4th in the planning stages and all the energy of an expansion that promised to turn the business into something much larger. He was not the majority owner, but he carried himself as though he were. He had the personality of someone who needed to be at the center of decisions, even when his formal position did not guarantee that. The other partners, 2 older, more conservative men who valued stability over risk, tolerated Trevor's overreach because he had a genuine talent for sales and for bringing in partnerships. He knew how to talk, how to convince, how to show up at exactly the right moment with exactly the right proposal. He was charming in the way certain people are charming, entirely centered on himself, but in a manner that took others a long time to recognize. Within the business, Trevor held direct authority over certain budget lines, specifically those tied to wellness programming and health partnerships. He had cultivated that autonomy carefully over the years, quietly enough that no one questioned his decisions in that area until there was sufficient reason to do so. Diana had known for a long time that her husband needed control the way other people needed air. But she had learned to call it his way instead of his problem. It was easier that way, and Diana, who spent her days making things grow for other people, had stopped paying attention to what was quietly wilting inside her own home, slowly, without drama, without announcement. It was in the early part of that same year, on a cold February evening, while the 4 of them sat at the dinner table with the low murmur of the television filling the silence no one remarked on, that Trevor came home with the restrained enthusiasm of someone carrying news he has been holding all day, waiting for the right moment to release it. A young couples therapist, recently licensed, had started attending one of the gym locations as a regular client. Jade Ellis was 26 years old, with what Trevor described as a level of professionalism unusual for her age, and a reputation that was growing quickly in the city. His proposal was straightforward. Bring her in for a premium program the network did not yet offer. Relationship coaching sessions aimed at corporate clients, a differentiator against the larger chains competing for the same market. "It makes sense," Trevor said, refilling his own water glass with the ease of someone who has already decided and is simply informing the others. "People pay well for this kind of thing. She has the right presence. Young, articulate, recently credentialed. It draws attention." Diana listened. She asked the questions an attentive wife asks, about cost, about actual demand, about how the program would fit into the existing structure. Trevor answered with the calibrated patience of someone who does not wish to be questioned but can still hide it well. The other partners approved the proposal in a brief meeting Trevor led with the energy of someone presenting a discovery. And, as had always been the case with that particular area of the budget, no one pressed hard on the details. The program would be run by Jade, the arrangement would be formalized with a monthly fixed salary, and Trevor would hold direct oversight of the partnership. Jade Ellis began working with the gym network in the first week of March. Diana met her exactly once, briefly, at an internal launch event one Thursday afternoon, when the partners gathered a small group of selected clients to preview the new offerings. She remembered a woman with an easy smile and very deliberate vocabulary, the kind of person who always seems to be observing slightly more than she participates. Jade was attractive in an understated way, with straight, dark hair pulled back in a low bun, and a posture that projected an authority uncommon for someone her age. Diana felt nothing particular in that encounter. No alarm, no sharpened instinct, none of those cinematic moments of slow-motion recognition. Only the impression of a competent professional being introduced in the appropriate setting. She drove home that Thursday evening, made dinner, helped Lily with a school essay, waited for Trevor, who arrived close to 11, saying he had stayed behind talking with the partners after the event, and did not think about Jade Ellis again. The months that followed moved at the usual pace. Diana finished projects, started new ones, met with clients, picked up the kids from school on Tuesdays and Thursdays, and prepared dinner on the evenings Trevor came home late, which had become more frequent since March. He always had a ready explanation: a meeting with potential investors, a walkthrough of the new location, an operational issue at one of the gyms, a contract that could not wait until the next morning. The explanations were always plausible, always work-related, always delivered with the lightness of someone who does not feel the need to justify himself beyond the bare minimum. Diana listened. Diana accepted. Diana slept. The Harmon household continued with the quiet efficiency of a well-oiled mechanism that nobody thinks to open and examine. Until that Tuesday morning in October, Diana had 2 appointments scheduled for early afternoon. A project presentation for a couple who wanted to completely redesign the back garden of their home, followed by a site visit to a restaurant opening an outdoor seating area that needed guidance on plants suited to direct sun. Before leaving, she wanted the house in order. She had arranged for the mother of one of her clients to stop by for coffee late in the afternoon, one of those brief visits that mattered for the kind of relationship that kept referrals coming. The house was carrying that particular kind of early week disorder. Crumbs on the kitchen counter, visible dust on the pale wood floors, a trail of dried mud that Ryan had tracked in from soccer practice the previous Monday evening. The robot vacuum sat in its charging dock in the corner of the living room, as it always did. That small, circular, white device that Trevor treated with more consistent attention than he gave to certain conversations between the two of them. The machine was programmed to run on Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays. Today was Tuesday. Diana needed a quick clean before the afternoon coffee, and there was no reason in the world to call Trevor over a robot vacuum. She looked at the device for a moment. Then she picked up her phone. The app was already installed. Trevor had put it on her phone months ago, though he had always been the one to open it. The password was the combination he used for almost everything, the one she knew by heart without ever needing it. She typed it in, found the scheduling screen, adjusted the start time to that morning, and was about to close the app entirely when something in the top right corner of the screen caught her eye. A small tab she had never noticed before. Root history. Diana could not explain afterward exactly why she tapped it. Maybe curiosity. Maybe that particular kind of involuntary attention the fingers have when they find something the mind has not yet processed. She tapped it. The screen opened onto a simple map with 2 locations marked in different colors. The first was her own home. The address she recognized immediately, with an extensive cleaning history logged on the programmed days. The second was a different address, in a residential area about 20 minutes away, marked in red. And beneath that red marker, the cleaning history. Tuesdays, Thursdays, and Sundays. Week after week, for at least 8 consecutive months. Tuesdays, Thursdays, Sundays. The exact days Trevor said he was closing up the gym late. Diana stood looking at the screen without blinking. The coffee on the counter had gone completely cold. Outside, a single autumn leaf struck the window and slid down the glass without a sound. She did not cry out, did not drop her phone, did not make any of those gestures a person imagines making when a piece of news splits the world in two. She stood in the middle of her kitchen with the pale October light still pressing through the blinds and felt something rearrange itself inside her. Not break, rearrange, the way a person turns a map upside down and realizes, finally, that they have been reading it from the wrong direction all along. She wrote the address down on a small piece of paper, folded it in half, slipped it into the same pocket of her bag where she kept notes for her clients. Then she picked up her car keys, gathered her project folder, and walked out the front door without looking back. She had work to do, and, by every indication, she had considerably more than that waiting to be uncovered. Diana drove to her first appointment on autopilot. She remembered parking the car, remembered walking up the front path of the client's home with her portfolio under one arm, remembered smiling and shaking hands and spreading her design sketches across the kitchen table, while the couple leaned in with the excitement of people who had been imagining this moment for months. She spoke about soil composition and sun exposure and the way certain flowering shrubs could create the illusion of depth in a narrow yard. She answered questions. She made notes. She scheduled a follow-up visit for the following Thursday. She did all of it with the practiced steadiness of someone who has learned, over decades of client work, that professionalism is sometimes the only reliable ground beneath your feet. But underneath all of that, underneath every measured sentence and every careful nod, there was a piece of folded paper sitting in the pocket of her bag, and a number that kept running through her mind with the quiet insistence of a dripping faucet. 8 months. The cleaning history at that second address went back at least 8 months, which meant that whatever was happening at that address had been happening since at least February. Since around the same time Trevor had come home one cold evening and told her, with that restrained enthusiasm of his, about a young therapist named Jade Ellis. Diana did not allow herself to draw the line between those 2 points. Not yet. There was still the part of her that wanted an explanation. A reasonable, ordinary, embarrassing explanation that had nothing to do with what she was beginning to suspect. Maybe it was a storage unit he was renting. Maybe one of the gym partners lived there, and Trevor had lent him the vacuum as some kind of favor. Maybe there was a perfectly logical reason why their robot vacuum had been cleaning a second address on the exact same days Trevor said he was working late, and she was simply catastrophizing because she was tired, and because 20 years of marriage had made her hypervigilant to patterns she could not yet name. She held on to that, maybe for exactly as long as it took her to finish the site visit at the restaurant, drive home, and sit down at the kitchen table with her laptop open and a cup of tea she would not end up drinking. Then she typed the address into a search engine. The result came back immediately. A residential complex about 4 miles from the gym's main location. A mid-sized building with a gated entrance, modest amenities, and the kind of online reviews that described it as quiet and private. Words that in the context of apartment listings sounded like convenience, and in the context of everything else felt like something entirely different. The building did not have a name attached to any of the gym's accounts. It was not near any of the 4 gym locations. There was no storage facility listed at that address, no commercial property, nothing that connected it in any visible way to Trevor's professional life. Diana closed the laptop. She sat for a moment with her hands flat on the table, feeling the grain of the wood beneath her palms, grounding herself the way she sometimes did when a project felt too large to approach all at once. In landscaping, there was a principle she had always believed in. Before you change anything, you observe. You watch how the light moves across a space, across different hours of the day. You study what is already there before you decide what to add or remove. You do not act on the first impression. You gather information until the picture is complete enough to trust. She picked up her phone and called Carol Myers. Carol was one of those friends who had been so present in Diana's life for so long that it was hard to remember the exact moment the friendship had formed. It felt less like something that had started and more like something that had always existed. They had met at a neighborhood block party over 15 years ago, when both families were newer to the area and had stayed close through school events, holidays, the particular solidarity of raising children in the same suburb, and the difficult years after Carol's marriage collapsed in what Carol herself described, without any trace of drama, as the most clarifying experience of my life. Carol was 51 now, sharp and practical, and completely without illusions about human nature. Not in a bitter way, but in the way of someone who had done the hard work of understanding exactly how people behaved when they thought nobody was paying attention. She answered on the second ring. "I need to ask you something," Diana said, keeping her voice even, "and I need you not to react until I finish." There was a brief pause on Carol's end. "Okay," she said, in the tone that meant she was already sitting down. Diana told her about the app, about the second address, about the cleaning history logged across Tuesdays, Thursdays, and Sundays for the past 8 months. She kept it factual, deliberate, the same way she described a project brief to a new client, without editorializing, without letting the emotion color the information before it had been properly examined. When she finished, the line was quiet for a moment. "Send me the address," Carol said. "You know the area?" "I know most residential buildings in this city better than the people who live in them." "Send it." Diana typed it into their message thread and waited. She could hear Carol on the other end, the faint clicking of what was probably her keyboard, the soft sound of professional focus settling over her like a second skin. "I know that building," Carol said after a moment. "It's a mid-rise, mostly 1- and 2-bedroom units, about 80 apartments total. Decent management, minimal turnover, popular with people who want something low-profile. Young professionals, people in transition, people who want a lease that doesn't ask too many questions." She paused just long enough for the implication to land without being stated. "It's not the kind of place you rent for storage, Diana." Diana said nothing. "Have you looked at the credit card statements?" Carol asked. "Not yet." "Look at the statements. Go back as far as you can. If the app is connected to an account with payment information, check whether the subscription charges are on the joint card or on something else. If they're on the joint card, that's a starting point." Carol's voice was even, careful, the voice of someone who had walked this particular terrain before and knew where the soft ground was. "Don't confront anyone yet. Don't say anything to him. Just look at the numbers first. Numbers don't interpret themselves. They don't get defensive. They just sit there and tell you exactly what happened." Diana thanked her, hung up, and opened the bank's online portal. It took her less than 10 minutes to find the first entry. The app subscription, a monthly charge for the premium tier of the robot vacuum's service platform, appeared on the joint credit card statement, the same card they had shared for the past 12 years. The charge had been appearing every month for the past 2 years, which was how long they had owned the device. But beside it, in the same monthly statement, there was a second charge Diana did not recognize, a recurring monthly payment to a property management company, listed under a name she had to search to identify. When she did, the search returned the name of the management company that operated the building at the address she had found in the app. The rental payment had been coming out of their joint account every month for 8 months. Trevor had been paying rent at that address with shared money, under a listing that appeared in the account summary between a grocery store charge and a recurring streaming subscription, in a position so unremarkable that Diana had scrolled past it dozens of times without registering what it was. She sat back in her chair. Outside, The afternoon light had shifted. The kitchen was half in shadow now, the way it got in October when the sun dropped earlier than expected, as though the season itself was pulling back without warning. Lily would be home from school in about 40 minutes. Ryan had practice until 6. Trevor had texted at noon, a brief business-like message saying he would be late. Something about a meeting with a potential investor for the new location, not to wait dinner. Tuesday evening. Diana read his message again. Then she looked at the second address on the screen. Then she looked at the message one more time. She got up, put the kettle on, and stood at the window watching the last of the afternoon light move slowly across the backyard. The garden out there was one of her best-kept secrets. Layers of perennials she had planted over 7 years, timed to bloom in sequence from April through October, so that something was always flowering, always alive. She had designed it the way she designed every space she worked on, with care, with intention, with an eye toward what it would look like not just now, but in 5 years, in 10. She had put years of thought into that garden. She had never once applied that same attention to what was growing in the dark corners of her own marriage. The kettle clicked off. She did not move. By the time Lily came through the front door, backpack half falling off one shoulder, earbuds in, already talking about something that had happened at school, Diana had closed the laptop, put the tea things away, and arranged her face back into the version of herself her daughter expected to find at home. She listened to Lily's story about a disagreement with a friend over a group project, offered the measured perspective of someone paying full attention, asked the right follow-up questions, and started pulling things out of the refrigerator for dinner, with the practiced rhythm of a routine she had performed hundreds of times. She did not mention the address to Lily. She would not mention it to Ryan when he came home. She would not mention it to Trevor when he arrived, late as promised, smelling faintly of the gym, and something else she could not quite identify, but filed away with a precision she hadn't known she possessed until that moment. That night, lying in the dark, with Trevor's breathing slow and steady beside her, Diana stared at the ceiling and did what she did best. She observed. She let the information sit without forcing it into a shape yet. She thought about 8 months of Tuesday evenings and Thursday nights and Sunday afternoons. She thought about a robot vacuum quietly mapping the floor plan of a second home. She thought about a monthly payment hidden in plain sight between a grocery store and a streaming service. And she thought about Carol's voice on the phone, steady, practical, unafraid, saying, "Numbers don't interpret themselves. They just tell you what happened." The next morning, a Wednesday, Diana called Carol before 7. "I found the payment," she said. "Joint account. 8 months." Carol was quiet for a moment. Then she said something Diana had not expected. "I know a lawyer. His name is Patrick Holloway, and he specializes in exactly this kind of situation. Hidden assets, undisclosed financial arrangements, marital estate issues. He's thorough. He's discreet. And he will tell you in the first meeting exactly what your options are." She paused. "You don't have to use him, but you should talk to him before you do anything else. Before you look at anything else. Before you say anything to Trevor. Before you make a single move. Will you call him?" Diana looked out the kitchen window at the garden she had spent 7 years building, at the layers she had planned so carefully, at the things she had tended with such deliberate love, and felt something settle into place inside her with a quiet, almost frightening clarity. "Yes," she said, "I'll call him." She met with Patrick Holloway, the lawyer Carol had recommended, that same Friday afternoon, in a quiet office in a low-rise professional building not far from downtown. He was a man in his late 50s with a calm, methodical manner and the kind of unhurried attention that made Diana feel, for the first time since Tuesday morning, that she was in the presence of someone who would help her think rather than react. She brought the screenshots of the app's root history, the printed credit card statements with the relevant charges circled, and a handwritten timeline she had put together Wednesday night after the children were in bed. Dates, amounts, patterns, everything she had found organized in the clean, precise way she organized project documentation for clients. Patrick looked through everything without interrupting. When he finished, he set the papers down and looked at her. "This is a solid starting point," he said. "The use of joint funds for what appears to be a private expense unrelated to the marital household is something we can work with. But before we establish the full scope of what we're dealing with, I'd like to go further back in the statements. Not just 8 months. I want to look at the past 2 years. If there are other charges that follow a similar pattern, we need to identify them now, before anything is filed or discussed." He looked at her steadily. "Can you access the full account history online?" "Yes," Diana said. "Then I'd like you to download everything you can and bring it to me early next week. Don't share what you found with anyone other than Carol, and don't change anything in the app. Leave the root history exactly as it is. Don't delete, don't add, don't alter." He paused. "And don't give him any indication that anything has changed." Diana nodded. "One more thing," Patrick said, in the tone of someone adding something that was not, in fact, small. "You mentioned that your husband works with a business partner arrangement at the gym network. I want to understand the structure of that better, how the budget authority was divided, how expenses were approved, who signed off on what. If funds have been moved in ways that weren't fully authorized by the partnership, that becomes a different kind of issue, and it may be relevant." Diana drove home in the pale Friday afternoon light, thinking about roots and foundations and the things that grow in the dark, the things that a careful observer, looking at the right angle, at the right moment, in the right season, can finally learn to see. She spent the weekend behaving exactly as she always had. Saturday morning, she worked in the garden. Saturday afternoon, she drove Ryan to practice and watched from the stands with the other parents, cheering at the right moments. Sunday, she made breakfast for all 4 of them, listened to Trevor talk about a promising conversation with a new investor, asked 1 or 2 questions that showed she had been paying attention, and cleared the table when everyone was finished. Sunday evening, while Trevor was in the living room watching a game and the children were in their rooms, Diana sat at the kitchen table with her laptop and downloaded 2 full years of joint account statements. She organized them into a single folder, saved it to a drive, and sent the files to Patrick's office before closing the computer. Then she washed her coffee mug, turned off the kitchen light, and walked to the living room doorway. Trevor was stretched out on the sofa, one arm behind his head, watching the screen with the relaxed ease of a man who had not a single thing on his conscience. He looked up when he heard her. "You okay?" he asked. "Fine," Diana said, with the small, tired smile of a woman who has had a long week. "Just tired. I'm going to bed." He nodded and turned back to the screen. Diana walked down the hallway, past the closed doors of her children's rooms, and into the bedroom they had shared for 17 years. She changed, turned off the light, and lay in the dark, with her eyes open and her mind very, very quiet. She was not catastrophizing anymore. She was not hoping for alternate explanations. She was not the woman who left things to Trevor because she didn't have the patience for this kind of thing. She was observing, gathering, waiting for the picture to be complete enough to trust. And somewhere across the city, in a residential building 4 miles from the gym's main location, a small white robot vacuum sat quietly in its charging dock, holding, in its memory, every room it had ever cleaned, every corner it had mapped, every route it had traveled without a single person thinking to ask what it remembered. The following week moved with a slowness that Diana had never experienced before. Not the slow of a quiet Sunday morning, but the slow of someone walking carefully across uncertain ground, testing each step before committing weight to it. She went to work. She met clients. She designed a herb garden for a retired schoolteacher who wanted something she could tend herself, something manageable and forgiving. She talked about lavender and rosemary and the particular satisfaction of growing things you could use. She smiled at the right moments. She drove home at the right times. She cooked dinner and asked about homework, and reminded Ryan that his cleats needed to be left outside after practice. She lived, on the surface, exactly the life she had always lived. Underneath it, she was paying attention to everything. She noticed things she had never catalogued before, not because they hadn't been there, but because she had never had reason to file them away with such precision. The way Trevor's phone screen always tilted slightly away from her when a message came in. The way he answered certain calls by stepping out of whatever room they were in, not with any obvious urgency, just with a naturalness that suggested long habit. The way he had, over the past several months, started showering as soon as he got home on the evenings he said he'd been at the gym. Not unusual for someone who worked around fitness equipment, but notable now that she was paying attention to the pattern rather than accepting the explanation. The way he said, "I'll be late," more as a statement of fact than as something that required a reason. She noticed all of it. She wrote none of it down. It was not the kind of evidence that mattered to Patrick Holloway, but it mattered to her, not as ammunition, but as confirmation that her instincts, which she had quieted for years under the comfortable weight of routine, had not failed her. They had simply been waiting for her to listen. Patrick called her on Tuesday morning, exactly 1 week after she had first opened the Root History tab, to tell her he had reviewed the statements she sent over the weekend. "I'd like you to come in," he said. "Today, if possible." Diana rearranged her afternoon and was in his office by 2 o'clock. Patrick had the 2 years of statements spread across his desk, in a sequence that Diana recognized immediately as the kind of organized thinking she applied to her own work. Everything laid out in the order it needed to be understood, nothing out of place. He walked her through it, with the unhurried clarity of someone who had done this enough times to know that the information landed better when it was allowed to settle rather than rushed. The app subscription was only the beginning. Alongside the monthly rental payment that Diana had already found, Patrick had identified a series of additional transfers, smaller individual amounts, ranging from $300 to $800 each, made at irregular intervals over the past 22 months. They appeared in the joint account statement under the name of a financial services intermediary, described in the transaction record as consulting fees. When Patrick cross-referenced those amounts against the payroll documentation Diana had been able to pull from the gym network's shared administrative portal, access she held as a spouse listed on certain business filings, the picture became considerably clearer. Jade Ellis received a formal monthly salary from the gym's corporate wellness program. That was documented, contracted, and visible in the official records. But the transfers from the joint account, 22 months of them, totaling just over $14,000, did not correspond to any invoice, any session log, or any service record in the gym's administrative files. They were payments made outside the business structure entirely, drawn from the personal joint account, and labeled in a way that was deliberately vague enough to be overlooked in the ordinary course of managing shared finances. "He paid her from your shared money," Diana said. It was not a question. "From what I can see in these records, yes," Patrick said. "The payments begin about 6 months before the rental charges appear in the account, which suggests a timeline that started earlier than you may have realized." Diana sat with that for a moment. 22 months. The consulting fees had started 22 months ago, which placed the beginning of everything, or at least the beginning of the financial trail, almost 2 years in the past. She thought about 2 years of Tuesday evenings and Thursday nights and Sunday afternoons, and felt something cold move through her that had nothing to do with the temperature of the room. "What does this mean for me legally?" she asked. "It means that a portion of your shared marital assets was used without your knowledge or consent to fund what appears to be a private arrangement. That is relevant to any proceeding involving the division of marital property." Patrick folded his hands on the desk. "It also means that if similar unauthorized transfers were made through the business accounts, not the joint personal account, but the gym's operating funds, that becomes a matter for the partnership, not just for the marriage. I want to be clear with you. I can handle the marital side of this, but if there are discrepancies in the business accounts that involve the other partner's money, they would need to be addressed separately, through a process that does not involve you directly." Diana looked at him. "You think there might be business account transfers as well?" "I think it's worth understanding the full structure of how Trevor's budget authority within that partnership operated," Patrick said carefully. "You mentioned that he had direct control over the wellness programming budget. If the additional payments to Jade Ellis came partly from that budget line, from the partnership's money rather than exclusively from your joint account, then at some point that irregularity would surface in an audit." The word settled into the room quietly. Diana drove home thinking about it, about the new location Trevor had been working toward for over a year, the fourth gym, the expansion that was supposed to transform the business into something significant enough to attract outside investment. She knew, from years of dinner-table conversation she had half absorbed without intending to, that the opening of the fourth location would require a formal financial review as a condition of bringing in new investors. It was standard procedure, Trevor had explained once, the kind of thing that happened whenever a business moved from informal partnership to something larger and more structured. She had listened to him describe it with the enthusiasm of someone who has never considered that a review of that kind cuts in every direction, that it illuminates not just what a business has accomplished, but every financial decision that led it there. She thought about all of this without any particular feeling of satisfaction. What was coming would come on its own. She did not need to engineer it. She only needed to make sure that when it arrived, she was already standing on solid ground. That Thursday afternoon, Carol came over for coffee. It was a visit that looked, from any angle, like two old friends spending an hour together in a well-kept kitchen. And it was exactly that. But it was also something else, because Carol had not come only to listen. She had come with information of her own. "I drove past the building," Carol said, wrapping both hands around her mug with the calm of someone reporting on a property inspection. "I wasn't looking for anything dramatic. I just wanted to see it. It's a decent building, not luxury, but not neglected either. Secure entry, assigned parking, the kind of place where the management keeps its distance as long as the rent is paid on time." She set her mug down. "And, Diana, I want to say something to you that I wish someone had said to me when I was in the position you're in right now." Diana looked at her. "The hardest part is not finding out," Carol said. "The hardest part is the period between finding out and doing something about it. Because you still have to live inside your own life while you're preparing to change it. You still have to sit across the dinner table from someone you're no longer willing to protect. And that takes a kind of strength that nobody talks about, because it doesn't look like strength from the outside. It just looks like a normal Tuesday." Diana was quiet for a moment. Outside, the wind moved through the garden in a long, low wave, bending the ornamental grasses she had planted along the back fence 3 years ago. She watched them recover their shape slowly, the way grasses do, yielding completely to the pressure, then returning, strand by strand, to exactly where they had been. "I keep thinking about something Patrick said," Diana told her, "about the business audit. He didn't say it would happen. He just said that if the payments went through the business accounts as well, it would surface during a review." Carol nodded slowly. "And the expansion requires a review. Trevor's been working toward that fourth location for over a year. He talks about the investor meeting the way someone talks about a finish line." Diana looked at the garden. "He has absolutely no idea that the finish line he's running toward might be the thing that exposes him." Carol said nothing for a moment. Then, quietly, "Does that feel like justice to you, or does it feel like something else?" Diana thought about it honestly. "It feels like consequence," she said, "which is different." After Carol left, Diana stood in the kitchen for a long time. She thought about the robot vacuum, that small white device sitting in its dock in the corner of the living room, completely unaware of what it had set in motion. She thought about the fact that Trevor had configured it, controlled it, decided when it would run and where, had never once considered that it was keeping a record he hadn't written. He had been so certain that the technical landscape of their home was his territory alone, so completely at ease with the control he had built into every small system and device, that it had never occurred to him to check what those systems were quietly documenting. There was something almost poetic about that, not in a triumphant way, but in the way that certain truths about people reveal themselves through the very habits they feel most confident about. Trevor's confidence in his own control had been the thing that made him careless, and that carelessness had left a trail so clean and precise that it practically organized itself. Diana walked to the corner of the living room and looked at the robot vacuum in its dock. The small indicator light blinked steadily, green, steady, unhurried. She had been thinking about this for several days now, letting the idea move through her mind the way she let landscape ideas develop before committing them to paper, testing the logic, examining it from different angles, asking herself whether it was sound. She had already discussed the financial evidence with Patrick. She had already given him everything he needed to begin building the legal framework. The process was in motion, quiet and deliberate, and Trevor had no idea it existed. What Diana was considering now was not a legal strategy. It was something else, something personal, something that belonged entirely to her. Outside the careful choreography of attorneys and account statements and procedural steps, a single gesture, small, precise, and completely her own. She was going to let the robot vacuum finish what it had started. The idea had come to her the same way good design ideas always came, not as a sudden inspiration, but as a gradual recognition of something that had been there all along, waiting to be seen. The vacuum could be sent to a second address remotely, through the app. It had done it before, many times, on a schedule Trevor had set and never thought to question. The difference was that Diana now understood exactly how the app worked. She had spent 2 evenings reading through the full user guide, something Trevor had presumably never thought necessary, and she knew that the device's return-to-base function could be disabled manually from within the settings. Without that function active, the vacuum would clean until its battery depleted, and then stop wherever it happened to be, unable to return to the charging dock. It would stop in the middle of the room. It would sit there, small, white, completely out of place, until someone opened it to investigate why it wasn't working. And when they opened the dust compartment, which was the first thing any manual suggested checking when the device stalled unexpectedly, they would find what Diana planned to place there before sending it out. A note? Not a long one. Not a dramatic one. Not the kind of thing written in the heat of emotion that a person later wishes they had not sent. 4 words, in Diana's handwriting, on a small piece of paper folded once. She did not write it that night. She was not ready yet. There were still things she needed to confirm. One more conversation with Patrick. One more review of the documents she had gathered. She was not going to act until the preparation was complete. Until she was standing exactly where she needed to stand before the first domino fell. But she looked at that small white device for a long moment, with its steadily blinking green light, and felt something shift in her chest. Not anger, not satisfaction, not grief. Something quieter than any of those. Something that felt, for the first time in weeks, like being entirely herself. She turned off the living room lamp and went to the kitchen to start dinner. Ryan came home at 6:15, muddy cleats left outside as reminded, and went directly to the shower. Lily emerged from her room for exactly long enough to set the table and report on a test she believed she had done well on. Trevor arrived at 7:45, tie loosened, phone in hand, talking about the investor meeting scheduled for the following month as he hung his jacket on the hook by the door. Still running, Diana thought, toward that finish line. She served dinner. She listened. She asked one question about the investor timeline and received a detailed answer she already understood better than he knew. Afterward, while the children cleared the table and Trevor took a call in the other room, Diana stood at the kitchen sink, washing the serving dishes and looking out at the garden in the dark. She could see almost nothing out there, just the faint suggestion of shapes, the outline of the ornamental grasses against the fence, the shadow of the old oak in the far corner that had been there long before she had planted anything around it. But she knew exactly what was out there. She had put every plant in its place. She had thought about how each one would grow, how the whole composition would change with the light, with the seasons, with the years. She had built something that looked effortless from a distance, because the effort had been put in long before anyone was watching. She dried her hands on the dish towel, folded it neatly over the oven handle, and turned off the kitchen light. In 2 weeks, Trevor would stand in front of investors and partners at the launch event for the 4th gym location, ready to step through the finish line he had been running toward for over a year. What he did not know, what he could not know, was that Diana had already spoken to Patrick again that afternoon, and that Patrick had made one additional inquiry. A quiet, professional conversation with the accounting firm retained by the gym's majority partners, flagging a category of expenditure worth reviewing before any outside investors committed funds to the new location. Diana had not asked for the audit. She had simply made sure that the right people were looking in the right direction before the most important meeting of Trevor's professional life. The rest, as she understood better than anyone, was simply a matter of what was already there, waiting, patient, and inevitable, the way certain things in a garden wait for exactly the right season to finally come to the surface. The note took Diana 3 days to write, not because she did not know what she wanted to say. She had known that almost from the beginning, but because she understood, with the same care she brought to every decision that mattered, the timing was not simply a matter of when something happened. It was a matter of what had already been put in place before it did. She met with Patrick one final time on a Monday morning, 8 days before the investor launch event for the 4th gym location. He confirmed what she needed to hear. The documentation was complete, the filing was prepared, and everything was in order on her side. The accounting firm retained by the majority partners had received his inquiry the previous week, and had, according to Patrick's contact within the firm, already begun a preliminary internal review of the expense categories he had flagged. Patrick had not specified names or details. He had only pointed a trained professional eye in the right direction and allowed that professional to do what professionals do when they find something that does not add up. The timing of the event is not ideal for him, Patrick said. with the measured understatement of someone who had seen this particular kind of coincidence before. An audit finding presented in the context of an investor meeting tends to carry considerably more weight than one delivered in a closed office. Diana nodded. She was not thinking about weight or impact. She was thinking about the note. She wrote it that evening, after the children were in their rooms and Trevor was on a call with one of the gym's partners, pacing the back hallway the way he did when he was trying to control a conversation that wasn't going the way he wanted. Diana sat at the kitchen table with a small piece of paper, the kind she used to jot measurements and plant names during site visits, and wrote 4 words in her ordinary handwriting. Not large, not dramatic, just her normal hand, slightly rounded, the same script that had signed birthday cards and school permission slips and notes left on the counter for years. "See you in court." She folded the paper once, set it on the table in front of her, looked at it for a long moment. Then she placed it inside a small Ziploc bag, sealed it, and set it beside her keys. The following morning, a Tuesday, Diana waited until Trevor left for the gym and the children had gone to school. She sat down with her phone and opened the app one more time. She navigated to the settings panel she had studied carefully over the past 2 weeks and located the return to base function, a small toggle, default switched on, designed to send the device back to its charging dock when the battery dropped below 20%. She switched it off. Then she opened the scheduling panel, deleted the home address from the active cleaning route, and entered the second address in its place. She set the start time for 11 o'clock that morning. Then she closed the phone, picked up her bag, and drove to a client meeting across town. She did not think about what was happening at that address while she walked a retired couple through the redesign of their front yard, explaining why the existing hedgerow needed to be removed entirely before anything new could be planted. That sometimes the only way to build something that would last was to clear the ground first, completely, without sentiment. The couple nodded seriously. Diana smiled and kept talking. At 12:37 in the afternoon, her phone rang. She was sitting in her car in a parking lot, eating half a sandwich between appointments, when Trevor's name appeared on the screen. She looked at it for 2 full rings before answering. "Hey," she said. "Hey." His voice had that particular flatness it got when he was managing something and didn't want to show it. "Did you mess with the vacuum settings?" Diana kept her voice easy and slightly distracted, the way someone sounds when they're answering a question while doing something else. "I tried to run it this morning. The floors were dusty." "Why?" A short pause. There's been a problem with the app. I'll take care of it." "Okay," Diana said. "Is everything all right?" "Fine," he said. "I'll handle it." He hung up. Diana set the phone down on the passenger seat. She looked at the remaining half of her sandwich without seeing it. Her heart was not racing. Her hands were not shaking. She felt, instead, a peculiar steadiness, the kind that comes not from the absence of emotion, but from having made peace with a decision long before it was executed. She thought about what was happening at that address while Trevor was making that call. The vacuum, running its quiet circuit across an unfamiliar floor, mapping corners and baseboards, and the space beneath furniture with the same impartial efficiency it applied to everything. Its battery dropping, the return function dark, no signal pulling it home. The device stopping somewhere in the middle of the room, in the open, unhidden, conspicuous in the way only a completely ordinary object can be, when it appears somewhere it has no business being. And then Jade Ellis, genuinely irritated, Diana imagined, in the uncomplicated way someone is irritated by a malfunctioning appliance. Calling Trevor to report a broken robot vacuum with the expectation that he would come fix it, because that was what Trevor did. He fixed the technical things. It was his territory, his control. And Trevor, arriving, probably within the hour, letting himself in with whatever arrangement they had worked out between themselves, kneeling down to look at the device the same way he knelt down to look at any machine that had stopped doing what it was supposed to do. Opening the dust compartment to check the most obvious thing first, because that was where problems usually announce themselves. Reaching in, finding a small Ziploc bag. Inside it, a folded piece of paper. His wife's handwriting. 4 words. Diana had thought, in the weeks since she found the address in the app, that the moment she imagined most was a confrontation. The two of them facing each other across some charged space, everything said or screamed or wept. She had imagined what she would say, and what he would say, and how she would hold herself through it. But as the days passed, and the picture came into sharper focus, she had come to understand that the confrontation she had been imagining was not what she actually wanted. What she wanted was for him to know. Not through a scene, not through her voice breaking or his voice rising, not through any of the performances that people perform in those moments, just for him to know. In a room that was not her room, with Jade Ellis standing somewhere nearby, watching him open a compartment and find his wife there instead. She wanted him to understand, in that moment, that the space he thought he had controlled completely had never been as sealed as he believed. The sandwich went uneaten. Diana drove to her afternoon appointment, walked a restaurant manager through 3 options for the outdoor area's planting scheme, and was home before 4 o'clock. She picked up Lily from volleyball practice at 5:15. She started dinner at 6. Ryan came home at 6:30. Trevor came home at 8:40, later than usual, quieter than usual, with the particular quality of silence around him that Diana recognized now as the silence of someone reconstructing a version of reality they can still function inside of. He ate the plate she had left warm in the oven. He said the food was good. He asked Ryan something about the upcoming game. He did not look at Diana longer than was natural, and Diana did not look at him longer than was natural, and the kitchen moved through the ordinary sounds of a weeknight ending. Dishes, backpacks, the television turned low in the other room. Before bed, he came to the doorway of the kitchen where Diana was making tea and said, in a voice that was almost, but not quite steady, "We should talk this weekend." "Okay," she said, without turning from the stove. He waited a moment, as though expecting something more. When nothing came, he said goodnight and walked down the hall. Diana poured her tea, sat at the kitchen table, and sent Patrick a message. He's aware. She pressed send, closed her phone, and drank her tea in the quiet. They did not talk that weekend. Friday morning, before either of them had an opportunity to choose a moment, Trevor received a call from one of the majority partners, a man named Gerald, older and methodical, whose professional patience had limits Diana had heard Trevor describe, with a mix of respect and frustration over many years of dinner-table conversation. The call lasted just under 20 minutes. Trevor took it in the back hallway, and Diana, who was in the kitchen with the window open above the sink, heard very little of what was said, but heard enough. Gerald's name mentioned twice, the word audit once, and then a long stretch of Trevor's voice moving through the particular register of someone trying to sound untroubled while calculating very quickly. The launch event for the 4th gym location was scheduled for the following Saturday evening. A converted industrial space downtown, rented for the occasion, with catering and a full presentation for the investors and partners, and a small group of press contacts Trevor had spent months cultivating. He had talked about this event for so long, and in such specific detail, that Diana could have described the room layout herself. It was supposed to be the moment the business changed shape permanently, the moment the informal local partnership became something bigger and more serious, with outside capital and formal growth targets and everything that came with it. It was, instead, the moment the accounting firm's preliminary review became impossible to set aside. Diana was not at the event. She had never been invited. It was a professional occasion, and she had her own life to attend to, and she was grateful for that now, because she had no wish to be in the room when it happened. She was at home that Saturday evening, making dinner for the children, when Carol called just after 7:30. "It happened," Carol said simply. Diana turned the heat down on the stove. "Tell me." "My friend who works with one of the catering companies was there setting up before the event started. She said the accounting firm's representative arrived earlier than expected, and asked for a private conversation with the majority partners before the investors were seated. Whatever was discussed in that conversation, by the time the room filled up, there were two partners who were visibly not aligned with Trevor." Carol paused. "He did the presentation, got through the whole thing. But during the questions afterward, one of the investors asked directly about the financial review. Apparently word had moved through the room faster than Trevor anticipated, and the answer Trevor gave didn't satisfy the room. My friend said you could feel the shift." Diana stood at the stove with the phone pressed to her ear, looking at nothing. "The partners called a private meeting right there, at the venue, after the investors left," Carol continued. "I don't know exactly what was said, but I know that Gerald left that meeting looking like a man who had made a decision. And Trevor left looking like someone who had run very fast in a very specific direction and arrived somewhere he did not expect." After she hung up, Diana stood still in the kitchen for a long moment. She thought about the fourth gym, the building Trevor had walked her past once, pointing out the windows and describing what would go inside them with the enthusiasm of someone who had already decided it was his. She thought about 2 years of careful maneuvering, budget lines tended like private gardens, a parallel life funded from shared money and managed with the same controlling precision he applied to everything else. She thought about how completely he had believed in the architecture of what he'd built. How certain he must have been that none of the separate rooms would ever open into each other. A robot vacuum, quietly mapping its routes. A payment hiding between a grocery charge and a streaming subscription. A tab in an app that nobody thought to check. The following Monday morning, Patrick called with information that had reached him through professional channels. The majority partners, Gerald and his co-investor, who together held 62% of the business, had requested a formal partnership review meeting, scheduled for the upcoming Thursday. The accounting firm had confirmed, in writing, discrepancies in the wellness program budget line, totaling an amount they were not yet prepared to specify publicly, but which was, according to Patrick's contact, significant enough to constitute a material breach of the partnership agreement. Under the terms of their partnership contract, Patrick told her, a material financial breach by a minority partner triggers a buyout provision. The majority partners have the right to purchase the minority share at a valuation that does not include goodwill, meaning Trevor would receive the book value of his stake, not what his share might be worth in an expansion scenario. Patrick paused. In practical terms, he loses his position in the business and receives a fraction of what he would have gained if the fourth location had opened as planned. Diana was quiet for a moment. And the new location? The investors may still proceed, at the majority partner's discretion, without Trevor's involvement. She thanked Patrick and hung up. She sat at her desk, the small home office where she kept her design files and plant catalogs, and the framed photograph of the first large commercial garden she had ever completed alone, taken on the day of installation, before anything had grown in. and she thought about consequence versus intention. She had not wanted to destroy Trevor's career. She had wanted to understand what was true, and then to protect herself within it. The things that were falling now were falling because of what he had built, not because of what she had done, but because of what he had done, and the fact that what he had done could not hold its own weight once someone looked at it directly. She thought about Jade Ellis, 26 years old, recently credentialed, her professional reputation built on the promise of helping people navigate exactly the kind of damage that was unraveling right now across the city. Diana felt no particular hatred toward her. What she felt was something cooler and more precise. The recognition that certain choices have a logic to them that eventually closes in on itself, regardless of who is watching. That evening, after dinner, after the children were in their rooms, Diana sat across from Trevor at the kitchen table for the first time since the note. He looked tired in the particular way of someone who has been managing too many things for too long and has finally run out of surface to stand on. He did not try to explain. He did not try to deny. He sat there with his hands around a glass of water and said, eventually, in a voice that had most of the air taken out of it, "I know you've talked to a lawyer." "Yes," Diana said. "How long?" "Long enough." He nodded slowly, looking at the table. Outside, the wind had come up again, moving through the garden in that long wave Diana had come to love. The grasses bending and recovering, patient and unhurried, and entirely themselves. She could hear it through the kitchen window she had left open a crack, even in the autumn cold, because she had always preferred real air to still air, even when the real air was sharp. "The kids," Trevor said. "I'll talk to them," Diana said. "They'll hear it from me, not from anyone else." He looked up at her then, just briefly, just long enough for her to see that he understood what that meant. Not a threat, not a punishment, simply the truth of who was still standing clearly enough to speak. He nodded once more and looked away, and said nothing else. Diana stood, carried her glass to the sink, and looked out at the dark garden. Somewhere in the corner of the living room behind her, the robot vacuum sat in its dock, returned there by Trevor on that Tuesday, without comment, reset to its regular schedule without a word about what he had found inside it. The small green indicator light blinked steadily in the dark room, patient, unhurried, keeping its record of every place it had ever been. She turned off the kitchen light and walked down the hallway to speak to her children before they went to sleep. There were things she would not be able to protect them from. There were things no parent could. The particular grief of finding out that a person you built your idea of safety around was more complicated than you knew. But she could give them the truth before the noise of everything else reached them. She could make sure that whatever they felt about this, they felt it on solid ground, with a clear account of what had happened, and a mother who was still, in every way that counted, standing. She knocked softly on Lily's door first. Lily was sitting cross-legged on her bed with a book open in her lap when Diana knocked, though the book had clearly not been read in some time. It was open to the same page it had been on 2 nights before, Diana noticed, the spine creased at exactly the same angle. Lily looked up with those blue-gray eyes that had always felt to Diana like looking into a mirror set slightly back in time, and something in her daughter's expression told her that Lily had been waiting for this conversation longer than Diana had realized. She sat on the edge of the bed. She did not reach for softening words or careful distances. She spoke the way she had always believed children deserved to be spoken to, plainly, with respect for their intelligence and their right to understand the shape of their own lives. She told Lily that she and Trevor were going to separate, that this had not happened suddenly, and that it was not going to be reversed. that there were things that had happened inside the marriage that Diana would explain more fully when Lily was older, but that the most important thing she needed to know right now was this: none of it had anything to do with her, and none of it changed anything about who her parents were to her. Both of them loved her. That was not complicated. The rest was adult territory, and Diana was going to handle it like an adult so that Lily and Ryan could keep being exactly who they were without carrying any of it on their shoulders. Lily was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, in a voice that was steadier than Diana had expected, "Is Dad okay?" Diana looked at her daughter, 14 years old, with her father's height already starting to show and her mother's instinct for other people's distress, and felt something move through her chest that had no clean name. Not sadness exactly, more like tenderness so acute it was almost painful. "He's going to be okay," Diana said, and she meant it. Not as a consolation, not as a performance of generosity she did not feel, but as a plain assessment. Trevor would be okay, diminished in some ways, certainly, and forced to live with consequences he had built himself brick by brick, but he would not be destroyed. That had never been what Diana wanted. She had wanted the truth. She had wanted her ground back. Those were different things from destruction, and she had always known it. Lily nodded slowly. Then she closed the book in her lap and set it aside with the deliberate movement of someone putting something down to make room for what came next. "Are you okay?" she asked. Diana looked at her for a moment before answering. "Yes," she said. "I really am." Ryan was harder. He was sitting at his desk when she knocked, headphones around his neck, the particular expression on his face that he wore when he was bracing for something he already half knew was coming. He was 16, and he was his father's son in many of the visible ways: the height, the stillness, the tendency to process internally before speaking. And Diana had always understood that this conversation would be the more difficult one, not because Ryan was more fragile, but because he was more like Trevor, and the news would land in the specific place where admiration lives and require him to rebuild something there. She told him the same things she had told Lily, plainly, without minimizing and without overloading. When she finished, Ryan sat very still for a long moment, looking at the desk in front of him rather than at her. "Did he cheat on you?" he asked. Just like that. Flat and direct. Diana took a breath. "Yes," she said. Ryan nodded once, the way he nodded when he was absorbing something he did not want to show the full effect of. He did not say anything else for almost a minute. Then, quietly, "Are you going to be all right?" Diana had not cried once since that Tuesday morning in October when she found the address in the app. She had felt many things: the cold rearrangement inside her chest, the peculiar clarity of purpose, the focused steadiness of someone who has decided on a direction and is moving toward it. But she had not cried. She cried now, just briefly, just enough. Because her son was 16 years old and was asking her the question she had been asking herself for weeks, and hearing it in his voice, in that flat, careful register that was so completely him, made it real in a way that credit card statements and attorney meetings and route histories had not. She reached across and put her hand over his briefly. "Yes," she said, "I really am." He looked at her hand on his for a moment. Then he turned it over and squeezed it once, the way he had as a small boy reaching up from a crowd. Instinctive, unhesitating, completely certain. Then he let go and straightened in his chair, and the conversation moved slowly toward easier ground. And Diana stayed with him for another half hour, just talking about other things. His upcoming game, a class project he was behind on, whether the kitchen had any of the peanut butter crackers he liked, and she understood that this was also care, this returning to the ordinary, this choice to keep the world recognizable for as long as possible. She left his room close to 10 o'clock and stood in the hallway for a moment with her back against the wall and her eyes closed, listening to the quiet house around her. The hum of the refrigerator, the distant sound of traffic through the window at the end of the hall, the small, familiar creaks of a structure that had held all of them for 17 years and would keep standing after the people inside it changed. She was still standing. The weeks that followed were not easy. Diana would not revise that. There was nothing clean or simple about dismantling 20 years of shared life, even when you were certain it was right. Perhaps especially then, because the certainty did not eliminate the grief. It simply kept it from becoming paralysis. There were attorneys and documents, and the precise, exhausting work of accounting for everything that had been built together and determining what belonged where. There were conversations with the children that she had not anticipated and emotions that arrived without warning at inconvenient times. Once, memorably, in the middle of a client consultation, when the couple she was meeting with mentioned casually that they had been married for 23 years and still agreed on everything, and Diana had to excuse herself for 2 minutes and stand in their hallway breathing very deliberately before she could go back in and finish the meeting. But she finished the meeting. She always finished the meeting. Patrick Holloway guided the legal process with the same unhurried precision he had brought to everything from the beginning. The documentation Diana had assembled, the root history, the credit card statements, the 2 years of unaccounted transfers, established clearly that joint marital assets had been used without her knowledge or consent to fund Trevor's private arrangements. The final settlement reflected that, and it reflected it significantly. Diana would not describe the outcome as winning. She would describe it as being fairly compensated for what had been taken, which was a different and more honest thing. Trevor, for his part, did not fight the settlement the way Diana had half expected him to. The partnership buyout had already taken the shape that Patrick described. Book value only, no goodwill, no share of the 4th location that would eventually open without him. He came out of the business smaller than he had entered it, which was perhaps the consequence he had not calculated when he was managing his parallel life with such confident precision. He moved into a 2-bedroom apartment on the other side of the city, maintained a regular schedule with the children, and was, to Diana's genuine if complicated relief, a more present father in the aftermath of the marriage than he had often been inside of it. She chose to notice that without commentary. The children needed him to be their father. That was enough. Jade Ellis she heard about only through the ordinary channels of a city that talks to itself. In the months following the audit and the partnership proceedings, both of which became, eventually, the kind of low-grade professional conversation that travels through business communities without anyone needing to amplify it. Jade's reputation underwent the quiet, irreversible shift that happens when the distance between what a person claims and what they do becomes visible to the people who were paying for the claim. Clients who had sought her out specifically for help with the most intimate and vulnerable aspects of their relationships found themselves sitting with a particular discomfort. A couples therapist whose professional foundation was trust, discretion, and the repair of broken commitments had been, simultaneously, the instrument of exactly those things breaking in someone else's home. They did not organize against her. They did not act out of malice. They simply, one by one, did not renew, did not recommend, did not return, and a practice that had been building momentum found, instead, the particular silence that follows when a reputation's supporting structure is no longer intact. Diana did not feel triumphant about this. She felt, if she was honest, something much closer to sad. Not for Jade Ellis specifically, but for the waste of it. for the choices that had been made when other choices were available, for the way human beings sometimes trade what they could have built for something they cannot keep. She opened her own studio in the spring. It was a small space, a converted storefront 2 blocks from the main street, with large windows that let in the kind of light Diana had always designed around, glass shelves holding samples of stone and tile, and dried plant specimens, a long work table that was always covered in sketches and plant catalogues, and the particular beautiful disorder of active thinking. She named it for the principle her father had taught her in those early years of kneeling beside him in the flower beds. Root and Light Design Studio. Simple. Honest. Exactly what it was. She had been afraid, before she opened, that the independence would feel more frightening than freeing, that she had been inside the structure of the marriage and the shared finances for so long that standing outside of it would feel like exposure. Instead, it felt like finally standing in the correct amount of space, like a plant moved at last to the right position, where the sun hit it properly and the soil was suited to its roots, and it could put its energy into growing instead of into compensating for where it had been placed. She hired a part-time assistant in the summer. By the autumn, she had more projects than she could take on alone, and a waiting list she managed with the same careful attention she brought to everything else. She understood her own finances now with a thoroughness that would have been unimaginable to the woman she had been 2 years before. Every subscription, every account, every recurring charge, every app and service and digital arrangement that touched her life. Not because she was afraid, but because she had learned something irreversible, that paying attention to your own life is not a burden. It is, in fact, the most basic form of self-respect. She also learned, fully and without shortcuts, how to use the robot vacuum. It had been a question, after the divorce was finalized and the house had been restructured into a space that was entirely hers, whether to keep the device at all. It carried associations she was not sure she needed in her daily life. But she had looked at it one afternoon. That small white thing in its dock, with its steady green light and its complete indifference to everything that had happened, and decided, with the particular logic of someone who has stopped allowing objects to carry more weight than they deserve, that it was a perfectly good vacuum cleaner, and she had paid for half of it. She kept it. She learned every feature of the app herself. She understood the root history, the scheduling function, the return-to-base toggle, the battery management settings, the firmware update process. She understood all of it, completely, because she had discovered that understanding things was not actually difficult. It had only ever felt difficult because someone had told her it was, often enough, and with sufficient casual certainty that she had eventually believed it. She never believed things like that about herself again. On a Friday afternoon in early November, 14 months after that October morning when the ground had disappeared beneath her feet, Diana sat in a small coffee shop 3 blocks from her studio. It was the kind of place that smelled like roasted beans and something warm baking somewhere in the back, where the light came in low through the front windows in the particular slanted way of autumn afternoons and made everything look as though it had been thought about before being placed. She had come in after a client meeting, intending to stay for 20 minutes, and had been there for almost an hour, her jacket over the back of the chair and a half-finished cup of coffee in front of her, and her sketchbook open to a page of ideas for a rooftop garden she was designing for a building downtown. On the chair across from her, because she had nowhere else to put it, and because the table was the right height for the charging cable she had brought, sat the robot vacuum, tucked into its carrier bag, visible through the mesh panel, its green light blinking with its usual patient steadiness. She had picked it up from the repair center on her way to the meeting, a routine maintenance appointment, nothing dramatic. A young server came to refill her coffee and stopped, glancing at the chair across the table with the mildly puzzled expression of someone trying to be polite about something they do not entirely understand. "Is someone sitting there?" she asked, nodding toward the vacuum in its bag. Diana looked up from her sketchbook. She looked at the chair. She looked at the small white device in its mesh bag with its green light blinking steadily in the afternoon sun. She thought about that Tuesday morning in October, about the route history on the screen, about the folded piece of paper in her pocket, about Carol's voice on the phone, about Patrick's desk covered in statements, about Ryan squeezing her hand in the dark, about Lily's eyes, about her father kneeling in a garden teaching her that certain things simply cannot be rushed. She thought about the note. 4 words in her ordinary handwriting, the look on Trevor's face when he came home that evening, that particular flatness, that quality of someone reconstructing the story they need to survive inside of. The green light blinking in the dark corner of the living room while she stood at the kitchen sink, looking at a garden she had spent 7 years building. The way she had walked out the front door that Tuesday morning with a folded piece of paper in her pocket, and the steadiness of someone who has decided to pay attention, finally, to everything. She smiled. Not the careful smile she had worn through those months of parallel living, not the professional smile of someone managing an impression, but the real one, small and unperformed and completely her own. "Actually," she said, "I think he might be the best roommate I've ever had." The server laughed, a bright and genuine sound, and refilled the coffee and moved on to the next table. Diana turned back to her sketchbook. Outside the window, the afternoon light moved across the street in that slow, low November way, reaching everything it touched with the particular patience of a season that understands it has very little time left, and chooses, despite that, to be beautiful. She picked up her pencil. She drew the first line of the rooftop garden. She knew exactly what it needed. She always did.